So many of you wrote in before this webinar saying what you would like me to cover. And there were a lot of questions about solving problems, solving multi-generational issues, which is, of course, totally normal. But the first topic that I want to cover is shifting that perspective. What if, instead of viewing the multi-generational mix as a problem to overcome, what if we view it as an opportunity to be realized? That's really my thesis statement for this webinar. How do we leverage and optimize generational differences as opposed to seeing them as problems to overcome? What if we take this generational change that's happening today and see it as a business and personal opportunity, really as a moment to take everything that we do and put it on the table and ask, what are we doing because we've always done it and maybe it's time to let it go? What are we doing that we've always done because it works and we should never stop doing it? And what are some new, innovative, maybe disruptive things that we can do that we haven't thought of before that perhaps a new generation can bring to the table? And I always want to say that this sort of warning, that I know we are all unique individuals, and generations, which we're going to talk about for the rest of our time, are just one lens that we can use to view people. This is not the be-all and end-all answer to all of your management and career issues to talk about generations, because some issues are generational and some are not. You might have a communication conflict or a weird people management issue, or any kind of interaction that may or may not be related to generational differences. So always, always, always during our time together, remember that we are all unique individuals, but the generational concepts or constructs can give us clues to how certain interactions might be better handled. So let's take a quick look at those generational cohorts. This is the chart. And there's a lot of dispute over what the different generational cohorts and exact years are. So I tend to agree with the Pew Research Institute, and those are the numbers that you'll see on your screen. There's actually no day at the hospital where they sort of say, you are the last Gen Xer and the next baby born will be the first millennial. So you may find yourself identifying with the generation related to your year of birth, or maybe you feel completely different, and all of that is legitimate. I know that we have people watching this webinar from other countries. These are very American years and generational titles, so this is, of course, different in other countries. But I would note that the concept of generations really is universal and global. While the generations have different names in other countries, generations are really a family concept. So we all understand this idea that the times in which we are born can impact how we see the world. And in fact, one of the ways that I think about generations and that I describe it to people who might be skeptical is that the times in which you're born here in the United States are almost like being born into a different country. So I would argue that being born into the US in 1920 is in many ways a different country from being born into the US in the 1960s or the 1980s or today. So we're really talking about cultural differences as well as age differences. And there are some factors that are more related to life stage as opposed to generation. Now, all of that said, it's no secret that I find value in generational understanding. It's what I study, it's what I teach. So here are some of the drivers that people talk about when they break people into these generational cohorts. And this is a bit of stereotyping here, but you may have observed that if you work with a member of the traditionalist or greatest or silent generation, that there's a really strong sense of pride and loyalty. This is a generation that survived the Great Depression, that had strong military service, particularly during World War II. 50% of men of the traditionalist era served in the military, and you see that reflected in the loyalty, in the hierarchical structure, in the pride that we have in the workplace for this generation, which is almost entirely out of the workplace, but still very influential. Then you have the baby boomer demographic. Baby boomers for most of their lives were the largest generation in American history until their children, the millennials, come along. And much of the baby boomer era is defined by this large size, growing up with more siblings in a family, with more children in a neighborhood, with more competition at school and in the workplace, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, opening up public institutions, corporations, business to many, many, many more people. So status and competition are really notable for many members, not all, of course, but many members of this era, not to mention the first television generation. So baby boomers are heavily influenced by marketing, by consumption, by bigger, stronger, faster, better. And we still see that with the baby boomer generation. Even today, about 3/4 of governors and congresspeople running our country are still members of the baby boomer generation, all of whom are over the age of 50. Then you have my generation, and some of you listening, Generation X. We were called the baby bust generation, the smaller generation. Many of our parents are traditionalists or older baby boomers. And we were born during times of change after that very, very, very large and dominant baby boomer era. So we tend to be more independent. As children of the 50% divorce rate, we were the latchkey kids who came home and took care of ourselves. We had fewer siblings, fewer kids in class. We were often on our own. And that is then impacted by the dawn of personal computing, that we could take care of ourselves and spend our time with Atari, with our personal computers, with very, very early cell phones and maybe fax machines if we were really precocious. Generation X is often noted by our independence, and we often see that in the workplace as well. Millennials, who I spend a lot of my time talking about, many of you listening are, of course, millennials. Generation Z is a synonym for millennial. This is a generation that were the children of the baby boomers, many of whom had a lot of adult involvement in their lives, from parents and teachers. Of course, the dawn of the internet and social media put so much emphasis on personal branding, self-realization, actualization, personal meaning, a lot of parallels with the baby boomer era. And for this generation, because of technology, almost living lives both in person and online. And certainly we'll talk more about the millennial generation. Generation Z comes next. We're hearing a lot about Gen Z, and many of you said this is one of the topics you most wanted to discuss on today's webinar. This generation is roughly age 20 years old on the old end, so seniors in college just entering the workforce for many companies. I want to talk a little bit more in depth about Generation Z because we're just really learning about this generation. They're mostly the children of Generation Xers, so tracking as a very, very small generation, born after 9/11 and the global financial crisis, also born to a smaller generation of parents. So 2011, when my own daughter was born, is actually recorded to have the fewest number of births in the United States since the Great Depression. So smaller classroom sizes, a smaller generation overall in the shadow of the older millennials, just as Gen Xers often grew up in the shadow of the baby boomers. Diversity is a very strong marker of this generation. Gen Zs will be the first majority non-white generation in American history. Also resistant to defining gender, defining cultural backgrounds, defining color and race. Blended identities are very popular with this generation. Calling them the plurals is something that has been discussed with Generation Z. They're also known sometimes as the homeland generation. They are getting driver's licenses later because of technology. They are not dating or having sex or smoking or experimenting with drugs until they're a little bit older. Very, very different from earlier generations. Many attribute that to technology, and you can see at the top of your screen that IGEN is another name that's been applied to this generation. I mentioned the financial crisis because of going through that, in some ways similar to the Great Depression, perhaps seeing their parents laid off from jobs, seeing that the stock market and housing prices don't always go up. That has an impact. So we're often seeing this generation with higher rates of savings, more desire for entrepreneurship. And of course, social media, mobile technology, virtual reality. This generation absolutely immersed from birth into all of the technologies that we have. One of the results of that you might be seeing for those who are listening from college campuses is a desire for more, quote, authentic communication. So rather than the perfect, glorious image on Instagram, you might have the messy morning selfie on Snapchat, the desire to show life as it really is, as opposed to making everything absolutely perfect. So now that we've talked a little bit about these characteristics of the generations, which I know are generalizations, I want to talk about all of this in context and why we're having this conversation now. What we're really talking about when we talk about generational differences is change and how to adapt to it. And a question I hear a lot from my clients is, well, we've had young people enter universities and workplaces every day for all of history. Why is this such a big deal right now? And this chart from the Pew Research Center, I think, answers that question. We are in this red circle that you can see in your screen. For those of us in North America, we have been operating in what has been an incredibly baby boomer-dominated workplace for decades. Just to give you a personal example, if you look at this chart of roughly the last 20 years of the U.S. labor force across all industries up to 2015, I happened to graduate from college in 1996. I'm a Generation Xer. Gen Xers are that blue line, the second from the top. When I entered the workplace, it was totally clear that baby boomers were dominant. It was their world, the way we communicated. All of my bosses, most of our clients and customers, the management style, all of it was dominated by boomers who had been trained by the silent, hierarchical, traditionalist generation, many of whom retired at traditional retirement age, and as you can see, eased out of the workforce. Only about 3 million or so members of that generation still in the workplace. So as a Gen Xer, for the first decade at least of my career, everything was dominated by baby boomers. We didn't talk about the generational mix. Nobody talked about adapting to Gen X. We simply did things the boomer way. And Gen Xers, numbers are destiny, we were never large enough. There just weren't enough of us to take over from those boomers. You can kind of sort of see in 2013 that Xers were the largest generation in the US workforce for about 15 minutes, and then we were already on a decline. We kind of never had our moment. And I don't think it's an accident that I am so interested in this topic as a Gen Xer myself, because Gen Xers are really in the middle. We have to be bilingual. We had to adapt to the boomers, and now we're being asked to adapt to the millennials. That can be a tough place for us to be, but it also gives us an opportunity to really understand both of those very, very large generations that we're sandwiched between. Millennials, of course, that dark blue line, were not even in the workforce when I started and have just been absolutely on a rocket ship to become the largest generation in the workforce in 2015. That generation, millennials, will be 50% of the US workforce by the year 2020. And experts predict that millennials will be 75% of the US workforce by 2025, less than 10 years away. So there's no question that the millennial style of work will be dominant. However, what today is about, and for the next many, many years, is even though millennials are now the largest generation in the workforce and many of the companies and organizations that you work for, even when millennials are 50% of the workforce, it's still 50% all the rest of us. Even when millennials are 75% of the workforce, it's still 25% all the rest of us. And different companies, different schools, different organizations have a different percentage mix. So it asks you to think about during this webinar, what does your red circle look like? What is the generational mix in your office right now, on your team, in your customer or client base, in your organization as a whole? Any room you walk into, any networking event you attend, you will be in that mix. And I think one of the most essential tools that workers need today, particularly those of us who are leaders, is to be able to manage this mix. It is unprecedented. We now have 4, and now with Gen Z's 5 generations in the workplace, and there is no guarantee in that red circle who will be in the leadership role. People change jobs more frequently. You don't know who will have the longest tenure. It used to be the one with the grayest hair had probably been there the longest. That's not necessarily true anymore. And just to give you one data point, 38% of Americans today are managed by a boss who is younger than they are. So what do we do about this? Here are 3 key high-level thoughts to keep in mind. And these ideas will recur during this webinar, and I repeat them over and over to my clients and speaking audiences. 3 keys to multi-generational success, whether you are a leader or an individual contributor or a student. Number 1, empathize. It is so critical to learn about the experiences of other generations to understand their values, priorities, and preferences. Often I find it's easier for older generations to empathize with younger generations because we see the world they live in. It's sometimes harder for younger generations to know what the world was like before they were born, before the technologies that they know today. Number 2, we have to be flexible. I often get asked, well, which generation wins? Who has to bend to the other? I don't think that's the right question. I think we need to flex and adapt for each other. So in any situation, we shouldn't ask, do the baby boomers win on this one, or do the millennials get their way? The question is, what is best for the organization? What is the right answer for the client? And then we find the solution that fits. It's really not about one generation winning over another. And finally, perhaps my favorite quotation of all time from Voltaire: common sense is not so common. When there is a conflict at work, in a personal situation, if you suspect that there is a generational component, I would ask that after today you consider that the other person was trying to do the right thing. For example, if I say, hey, go get in touch with Bob, if I say that to a baby boomer, they might walk over to Bob if he's in the office. They might pick up the phone and call Bob. If I say that to a millennial or a Gen Z, they might text Bob or send an email to Bob. The interpretation of that direction might be very different based on who you are. We all know this just from personality types. If I say come in early tomorrow, that might mean 9:30 to one person and 7 a.m. to another. But if you assume the other person is trying to do the right thing, you will often have a better starting point for finding common ground. Just to add one more example to this that just occurred to me that I hear all the time is I get a lot of complaints from more older executives who say, it drives me crazy that the millennials on my team always have their earbuds in their ears. And my question is, well, what if you assume the best intentions? Why do you think they have their earbuds in their ears? Do you think that they're doing it to drive you crazy? And they always laugh and say, of course not. I don't think they're purposely trying to drive me crazy. So I ask, why do you think they're wearing them? And either they come up with the answer or they ask the millennials themselves, which I think is always a great suggestion. And often the answer, as many of you know, is, I'm trying to be as productive as possible. Listening to music makes me productive. When you start from that side of the discussion, you can say, I know you're more productive, but in this situation, I'd like you to be available. So when you give the correction or request to change the behavior, you can do it from a more positive perspective when you've taken the time to empathize, flex, and assume the best intentions. So with these 3 overarching goals, let's get more granular. I think we can focus our energy in 3 areas of an organization or 3 areas of your own career. And I like to portray them in terms of the transitions from older generations to more modern times. And the fact is, all of us are working today, but some of us know what it was like before. Others have simply arrived in the current time. So our expectations might be different. Let's talk first about expectations of leadership. For traditionalists, for boomer and many Gen Xers, we just assumed and were immersed in a world where leaders were command and control. Do as I say. because I said so. Now there is much more emphasis on coaching, on personal development, on spending time with your team. I believe that all of us from previous generations would have loved a coaching style of leadership. We just didn't know it was possible. So often when you serve the needs of a newer generation, you're actually fulfilling the needs of other generations as well. It's just more of a bonus for us. It's something that we didn't expect. We'll talk a lot about coaching today. Next is the experience of going to work, the work environment, the work hours, the community that you build, the culture. In the past, this was very uniform. There was a career ladder. There was a specific track. There were work hours 9 to 5 or whatever it was in your organization. Now, certainly as consumers and more in the workplace, we live in a world of unlimited options. We can work from anywhere with the technologies we have today. Different companies offer all different kinds of work environments. Our hours can be very, very different and flexible. Career paths can go in a variety of different directions. Where can you use today as an opportunity to think of more options for yourself and the people who work with you? And finally, so many of you are joining today because you wanted to talk about communication issues. In the past, communication was very much based on a need-to-know basis. How many of you were told at some point in your career, I can't tell you that, that's above your pay grade, or you don't need to think about that right now? Certainly, I wanted to know as much as possible, just nobody would tell me anything early in my career. Now, thanks, of course, to the internet and technology and social media, there's an expectation of transparency. We assume that we can click a button and find out anything we want to know. If I could tweet at a world leader, it feels really weird if you tell me that I can't talk to my boss's boss. It's just a different expectation. Also, many people in the workplace today, particularly those just entering, feel a desire to contribute on day one, to feel that work is purposeful and meaningful. For many previous generations, that was something you earned over time, that you got to experience when you were the CEO. Now, many young people want to make a difference in their career, in their work from day one. So where can you think about transparency and purpose in your own career? So these are the themes that I think are important to talk about today. And I want to show you that these are backed by data. Laszlo Bock wrote a terrific book called Work Rules about how Google runs. And Google, of course, wanted to know the data. What actually makes someone a good manager? What actually makes somebody successful? And they launched a program called Project Oxygen, where they studied 10,000 people managers. And what they learned is that employees of every generation wanted 3 things from a boss. First, someone who makes time for one-on-one meetings. I would define that as coaching. Everybody across all generations appreciated a leader who made time for them. Second, they wanted leaders who helped them solve problems, who gave them options and choices, didn't say there was a one-size-fits-all approach. And finally, employees of all generations want managers and leaders who take an interest in their lives and careers, who want to be a whole, authentic, transparent person, and who want them to achieve purpose in their lives. Now, note that millennials and other generations, and I know this is a Google example, but notice what is not on this list. We are not talking about ping pong tables. We are not talking about bringing your dog to work. We are not talking about working 2 hours a day. We are talking about good, old-fashioned management. I am not going to recommend a single strategy on this webinar that has not existed for decades. So if all of this stuff has been around forever, what is the problem? Here is how I would define it. And this is one of my favorite stats from the Harvard Business Review. This is kind of a classic study that you might have seen before. The average age at which a person becomes a manager of people, in general across all industries, is the age of 30. But the average age that someone receives any training whatsoever on how to manage people is 42. So you might notice a bit of a delta there. This is why when I teach some of my tactics and strategies, some managers say, Yeah, we're doing those things already, because good managers are good at managing any generation. The problem is so many people get thrown into management that they haven't learned good habits and techniques. So if you're listening today as a manager, I'll have lots of strategies for you and those who are aspiring to be managers. And if you're not yet a manager or have no interest in managing people, I'm also going to talk about succeeding in the multi-generational mix as an individual contributor as well. So what we're going to do is build your personal toolkit of best practices. Some of these ideas you might have heard before, some might be new. The trick is to really add them to your daily toolkit of habits. This is what the best companies, the best leaders, the best individual contributors are doing. Many of these I've had the honor of learning firsthand through clients and speaking audiences and friends and colleagues. And again, you'll notice that none of these are high-tech or new. They're classic, back-to-basics recommendations that can become daily habits, and I think are even more important in a multi-generational workplace. So I have 7 tips to share, and then we'll break for Q&A at the end. Number 1, give frequent, actionable feedback. I wrote a book called Becoming the Boss, and I interviewed 100 bosses, just people managers. And one of the questions I asked was, what is the best book you've ever read, not on strategy, but just on how to manage another human being? And by far, the number 1 answer, by far, was The 1 Minute Manager. The 1 Minute Manager was originally published in 1982, instant global bestseller. Well, you notice on your screen, this is the new 1 Minute Manager, and I don't think it's a coincidence that for the first time in 35 years, this book was re-released in a new edition in 2015, which you might remember is the exact year that millennials became the largest generation in the workplace. I think the concept of 1 minute management is more important now than ever. And I will teach you the 1 Minute Manager strategy in less than a minute, which is to give people 1 minute specific praise. Here is what you did well, and I will tell you what you did well. And 1 minute specific correction. Here is what you might do differently next time. We are all time-starved people. Everybody has 1 minute to give specific direction. Now, some of you might be thinking, that's for millennials. Millennials want constant feedback. Millennials always feel entitled, getting told how they're doing every minute. They want gold stars. They want trophies for participation. It's a stereotype we always hear. That's the millennial thing. And in fact, according to a PwC study, 72% of millennials under 30, the majority of the millennial cohort, said they want feedback on a daily or weekly basis. But here is the corresponding statistic for other generations as well. 60% of employees over the age of 30 want feedback regularly also. 1 minute management works across the board. Now, you'll also notice, of course, that 28% of millennials, 18% of millennials and 40%, 28% of millennials and 40% of those over the age of 30, they don't want as much feedback. That again proves that we're all unique individuals. But the point here is that many of us of previous generations just became accustomed to not getting feedback. We just got used to not knowing how we were doing, but we all wanted it. So if you get in the habit of giving more feedback, more communication with your employees, it will have a positive effect. This still leaves the challenge of how to make time to do this, particularly if you manage a lot of people. So I'm often asked, I'd love to coach. I'd love to give feedback all day long. Some people say it's their favorite part of their job. But how do you provide all of this individual attention when everyone is so busy, when people are working from all different locations and every person has a different style of feedback that they want? You can't be available 24/7, 365. You absolutely, as a leader, need to set boundaries. But you do have to offer people ways to get the feedback they so desperately want. And frankly, the more feedback you give, often the better results you get. the better productivity and effectiveness you get because people are getting feedback on how to improve their work. So a couple strategies I've seen work really well. One is office hours. This came from a millennial, from a client I worked with, and he said he told all of his employees, and by the way, he was a millennial managing almost entirely people older than he was. He said, from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. every day, I will be at my desk. Consider it office hours. You can come in, you can call me, you can text me, you can Skype me, you can instant message me, but I will be available for career conversations, for feedback, anything you want to talk about from 8 to 9 a.m. every day. After that, I may or may not be available, but I will have no problem saying no to requests because those are the office hours available to you. He said it has worked beautifully across all generations to set that time specifically for any conversation or feedback that people want to have. Now, I've talked a lot about the importance of in-person time of feedback, but millennials often tell me, and Gen Zs as well, that they don't mind if feedback and support and coaching come through technology. So some people use texting with employees, some do not, and that's your choice. But all of us use email, a quick email to say, great job on that work. How are you doing? A quick 1-minute feedback by email can be amazingly effective, particularly if you are someone who is out of the office a lot, or if you have virtual employees. Even an instant message of quick feedback, I'd be cautious on too critical feedback, but certainly positive feedback or a small 1-minute correction can absolutely take place using technology. But of course, in-person is often so valuable. And people often ask me, do millennials just want technology? And the answer is no. Every generation values in-person, which is why MBWA is one of my favorite acronyms. Yes, I have favorite acronyms. MBWA is management by walking around. Feedback does not have to be a meeting that's formal with notes and bullet points. You can just walk around and chit-chat with people. I love the story that Steve Jobs developed the Apple headquarters to make sure the bathrooms were as far away as possible from where employees sat so that you'd have to bump into people. You'd have to have those spontaneous conversations. You can do that as a leader as well, and it's appreciated by all generations. If you are an individual contributor, or really anyone who has a boss, the best way to get more feedback, if you don't feel like you get enough, is to implement the feedback you receive and report back to the person who gave it to you. Say, hey, thank you so much for telling me that I should improve my speaking skills. I went and I worked on this presentation. What do you think? How did I do? That shows the person that you listened, that you took action, and that you're interested in more feedback. And I'm currently reading Tools of Titans. I'll be blogging about it soon. Tim Ferriss says in Tools of Titans, if you want great mentors, become a great mentee. If you want to lead, you have to first learn to follow. If you want to be a good giver of feedback, you have to first be a good implementer and listener to feedback as well. Best practice number 2 is to invite apprenticeship. As I've already quoted, Voltaire said, common sense is not so common. Consider the fact that the best way to learn how to do something is to practice it and to watch someone who's good at it. A millennial or a Gen Z may not be great at talking on the phone, which other generations think of as common sense, because that millennial didn't grow up with a landline phone. She's literally never answered a call where she didn't know who was on the other end of the line with caller ID. So instead of bemoaning this and saying, how could a young person today not know how to talk on the telephone, invite that millennial to sit in your office and invite her to listen to you make 25 sales calls to learn how best to talk on the phone. I've never heard anybody say millennials aren't smart. They just don't have the same skill set because they haven't had the same life experience. That's just one example, of course. Or a baby boomer might not be great at navigating a particular app. Instead of criticizing him or calling him a Luddite and saying he doesn't understand technology, have him sit next to you and watch you use that particular app, or create a video tutorial where you can watch how you navigate through that particular application. The best way to learn is to watch an expert. And, you know, a lot of people are not fans of open office layouts. And personally, I think that's more of a personality issue, whether you're more introverted or extroverted, if you like that or not. But one of the things I think is an advantage of open office space is the way it allows you to eavesdrop on people and learn by watching others. Apprenticeship is the oldest method of training in the world. So where can you say to someone else on your team of any generation, come sit in my office, come listen to me do this, come watch me in this situation, or someone to listen in on a conference call, to learn how you negotiate, how you pitch an idea. Can you CC someone on your team on more emails? This is how I phrase this. This is how I interact or engage. Or can you put together examples? I work with a lot of law firms, and one lawyer told me, he was a partner, he said he wasn't happy with the writing of a lot of the junior associates in his firm. So instead of saying, write better, or your writing isn't good enough, he created a binder of dozens and dozens of documents and memos and emails and said, this is what good writing looks like. Can you show examples? A corollary to apprenticeship, I think, is mentoring, and particularly reverse mentorship, which is the idea that you have a relationship with someone of another generation. And it is not always that the senior person or the more experienced person mentors the more junior person, but it goes in both directions. Some people call this co-mentoring. Can you have coffee or develop and cultivate a relationship with someone of another generation? In fact, I had one manager who said every week he walks into his office and he goes to the youngest person he sees and says, can you put a new app on my phone? I want to play with what you're playing with. I want to see what you're using. Just filling our minds with different experiences and perspectives is so valuable in every way. Diversity and inclusion experts are masters of this, but we can do this intergenerationally simply by building more relationships across the multi-generational mix. If you're a leader, I would also ask you, when it comes to apprenticeship, are you truly modeling the behavior that you want your employees to demonstrate? Perhaps you need to take a closer look at your own habits. So if you're calling another generation entitled, where might you be demonstrating entitlement? If it seems your employees are always having their faces in their phones, where do you maybe too much have your face in your phone? And I love this quotation from the former UCLA basketball coach, John Wooden. The most powerful tool you have as a leader is your own personal example. And I just saw this on Twitter the other day. Adam Grant, who is the Wharton professor who wrote the book Give and Take and others, he posted this chart from Harvard Business Review. The impact of managers sending emails on Sunday evenings. The amount of email sent by employees on Sundays is directly related to the number of emails they get from their bosses. So if you want people to be more available, to talk more in person, to email less, are you modeling that and demonstrating that as a leader? Self-reflection is critical at every stage. The third of our 7 best practices is to have the style conversation. And this is my #1 workplace communication tip overall for everyone at all levels in any kind of organization. And it comes from Michael Watkins and his book, The First 90 Days, about succeeding in a new role. Ask instead of guessing. This will help you to minimize conflicts, misunderstandings, negativity, and wasted time and energy. We guess, should I email this person? Should I walk up to this person? How does this person like to have meetings? What kind of feedback does this person give? These are things that we can directly ask people. What is your style? And the reality is, if you are a junior person or you have a boss and you're managing up in an organization, it is your job, I think, to become the world's leading expert on the style of your boss, just as you would the style of your clients or customers. If you are a people leader, particularly in a multi-generational organization, one of the most generous and I think time-saving things you can do is tell the people who work for you how to best communicate with you. For example, how do you like to email? Short emails or long emails? Do you like to get email all the time, or do you prefer email, or do you prefer in-person meetings? Are you the kind of person where I can just drop by your office, or do I have to make an appointment? I don't think these are generational issues. I think these are often personal preferences. Do you like me to take notes? Do you want them to be detailed? Should I email them to you? Do you like them short or long? Do you want to know every word or just high level? How do you like your documents formatted? What is your favorite font? Maybe you have poor eyesight and you want me to use a bigger font. How do you get feedback? Do you want me to schedule a one-on-one? Should I come up with my own feedback and present it to you, or do you like to start the conversation? Do you like to give feedback once a week or in a more ad hoc way? How do you feel about working virtually? Should I check in with you all the time so you know I'm working, or do you trust me to get the work done? Do you like to work from home, or do you prefer to be in the office? And perhaps most importantly of all, we should all become experts on the pet peeves of the people we work with. The quickest way to alienate someone or to harm a relationship is to step on one of these pet peeves without even knowing it. Remember, generational stereotypes that one generation prefers in-person or text messaging, sometimes that's true, but the very best way to learn how to best work with people is to simply ask them what their preferences are. Best practice number 4, we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about things like benefits and rewards and training. The only way to even come close to satisfying the needs of a variety of different generations is, I think, to think a little bit more like Amazon, and that's where this image is from. There is no one-size-fits-all anymore. There is no one perfect crossover benefit that appeals to everybody in a multi-generational, intersectional workplace. There is not one reward or bonus that everybody wants, not even money. Many people would trade time for money. So the only way to serve the needs of multiple generations and diverse employees is to offer more choice and variety. I had a professor who said to me, I have people from 20 different countries and 4 different generations in my classroom. What should I do? And my answer was, I have no idea. I didn't even know that was possible. This is unprecedented stuff. So we can't try to find a perfect solution. We have to, I believe, offer more choices and options. So just as we did with the style conversation, when it comes to work environment, communication, training, rewards, and benefits, can you ask people what they want? Can you offer more choices? Now, I know this puts a lot of pressure on leaders. I don't mean for you to do that. This is not your job as a leader to solve everybody's needs. Ask people what they want. And this is more advice from Laszlo Bock, the former head of people at Google. He suggests that you invite people to come up with their own options. You don't have to offer everything people want, but some of the things they want might be easier than you think. So Laszlo Bock says, pick an area where people are frustrated and let them fix it. If there are constraints, limited time or money, tell them what they are. Be transparent with your people and give them a voice in shaping your time or company. You'll be stunned by what they accomplish. For example, I was working with a construction company that said, we send people of all these different generations out to these work sites in the middle of nowhere, and they're all working together in a trailer. How am I supposed to offer options? And my question to them was, have you asked your employees? And when they asked their employees, the employees came up with remarkable suggestions for what to do with that trailer. They all chipped in and bought a treadmill. There was a window that was covered over that they wanted to open. They wanted healthier food in the refrigerator. These were tiny little changes that had not occurred to the leadership that the people in the situation came up with. Now you'll notice this is not dissimilar to the good old-fashioned employee suggestion box, which has been responsible, I think, for a lot of good ideas. And just a quick aside that I wanted to share on the subject of some options being easier than you think. Again, the questions, do we need to offer free food? Do we need to offer people games in the office? Do we have to let people work from home? According to a Capital One survey, 62% of employees said the one thing they wanted to change about their workday is they just want to be near a window. They want a little bit more light in their day. When you ask people what they want, you can often be surprised by the answers. Now we've gone from the small, let's go up to the macro. I think it's incredibly important for all generations to connect with purpose in our work. I mentioned this as a millennial and Gen Z issue. I think it's deep for all of us. We want to feel that our work has meaning. And this was proven recently by KPMG. They encouraged everyone from the interns to the chairman to share stories of what their work really did. For instance, We Champion Democracy was the team that counted the ballots in the South African election for Nelson Mandela. They didn't say we count ballots, they said we champion democracy. You can see a badge that says 10,000 stories. KPMG wanted to collect 10,000 stories in a month. They collected 40,000, and they only have 27,000 employees. This improved morale, it got people excited about their jobs, and KPMG surged 17 spots on the Fortune Best Places to Work list. And for the first time in the firm's history, they were the top rated of the big four accounting firms on the Best Places to Work list. And that is true. I just checked for 2018 as well. You'll notice the faces on these posters are diverse generationally, ethnically, in terms of gender. All of us want purpose, especially, I think, when we're doing things that we don't love to do, like grunt work. Next time you're giving an assignment to someone, take a moment to tell them why that work is important. What is the bigger goal? Next time you're having a meeting, don't say, we're here to talk about the budget. Say, what is the real purpose of this budget? What are we trying to accomplish? Those small moments of purpose can make a tremendous difference. And that's true for individuals and teams as well. A question I get from a lot of clients is, how do you plan a team bonding event when you have people of all different generations? So in the old days, I think we were in the office more. We didn't need to plan team bonding. We just bonded because we were all around each other. You couldn't work from anywhere other than the office. But something's gotten lost now with all of the advantages of being able to work from anywhere. We've lost, I think, a little bit of the camaraderie. And I've had people say, I feel sorry for millennials and Gen Zs that they didn't get some of that experience that was so valuable to loyalty and just to having fun at work without ping pong tables and games. So now everyone has different priorities. Some of us are parents, some of us have different dietary needs. There's so many things that go into it. I think the absolute best thing you can do as a team, clear from the image on your screen, is to plan a team volunteer activity. It gives purpose to the team. Everyone from any generation can participate. And you know what? Give it an optional hashtag for those who might want to share on their preferred social media, which might be Facebook for a boomer or Snapchat for a Gen Z. Those who don't want to share don't have to. But the experience of being together and doing good is absolutely timeless. 2 more best practices, and then we will break for questions. Best practice number 6 relates to the overall career picture. Sometimes we are least transparent in our management and communications about people's own careers. And for those of us of previous generations, we just expected that our boss would kind of take care of moving us up the ladder. Well, nowadays, everyone is told to be the CEO of your own career and take charge of your development. But what happens is we're doing that while our bosses and companies may have an entirely different plan for us. I was on an airplane once, and a millennial guy was sitting next to me. He was very ambitious, and he said, here's my frustration. He said, I'm ambitious. I want to get ahead. And my boss keeps telling me, be patient. Your career is a marathon, not a sprint. And he said, okay, then tell me what mile I'm on. Give me some detail about where I am in my career, because I want to know what you have planned for me. Have you talked to the people on your team about where you see them going? If you don't feel the direction, have you talked to the people at your company about where you want to go? I think we need to have more transparent conversations. And I've heard them called stay conversations. Instead of having this conversation when you're leaving in your exit interview, why not have it now when you feel good? Can you schedule, if you're a leader, stay conversations with your stars? And if you are a star individual contributor, can you schedule a stay conversation with your team? Everyone wants to know where they stand. And finally, best practice number 7 is to show gratitude. Thanking people for their work, thanking your organization for a great job, thanking your team for all of the benefits that you get. There's a law firm that's one of the very few law firms on the 100 Best Companies to Work For list, and one of their best practices is every month, every partner at the firm receives a box of thank you notes, and the directive to the partners is send these. And one partner complained at the firm and said, that's just giving people trophies for participation. What's the point of sending all those thank you notes? And another partner said, no, you choose what work you acknowledge. You choose what people you thank, but nothing is more valuable to people than gratitude. Another lawyer said that she worked in the employment space, and one of her jobs was to listen to the complaint hotline at a lot of her clients' offices. And she said, if I could tell you the number of employee complaints that turn into expensive litigation that start with the employee saying, my boss never thanks me, my boss never acknowledges me, that's the beginning of bitterness and anger across all generational cohorts. So a simple thank you, a simple great job is an invaluable management tool. So to start with the very simplest, do you know people's names across generations, across the different roles at an organization, across the groups at your company? Are you letting people know the outcome of their work? That assistant who typed up a letter, did you let her know that that had a positive result? The junior person who did the math behind the sales pitch, did you let him know you won the business? People want to know not just that you're grateful, but that their work had meaning. And always remember that thank yous are absolutely free. It is such an underused tool in the management toolkit, and I've never met anyone of any generation who didn't appreciate a genuine thank you. So as we come to the end of our time and we turn to the Q&A, I want to give you a little bit of a homework assignment. Here are 5 recommendations of how to manage the mix in your career and your organization right away. Number 1, spend 1 minute providing or requesting feedback or just chatting with a colleague of another generation. I will implement this tomorrow by sending you a 1-minute survey from this webinar. Next, can you mention a personal communication preference to someone on your team so that they can better customize to your style? Next time you're preparing an important communication, training, or benefit, can you offer one other option of how people can have that delivered? Number 4, can you open your next meeting or phone call by discussing the why, the purpose of anything on your agenda? And finally, is there someone today that you can thank for a task well done? I'm always a fan of practicing what I preach, so I will do just that. Thank all of you for spending your very valuable time on this webinar. And I know I've joked about it, and I know not all of you are millennials, but I also wanted to offer you a trophy for participating in this Managing the Mix webinar today. Thank you so very much. And now I will turn to your questions. Okay, the first question, this is from an anonymous attendee. How do boomers get over the bias created by the fact that their own children are millennials and we see how, quote, immature they are outside the workforce? You know, I actually see that from the opposite perspective. I find many baby boomer leaders feel that it's an advantage that they have children who are millennials because they understand that perspective, they understand that mindset and the expectations and the tools and experiences that their children have had. It's almost like having a reverse mentoring relationship within your own family. So I'd encourage this attendee and anyone with the same question to really think about the positives of having a millennial so close to you. Ask them what management they're looking for. Ask them what communication styles are most effective to them. And if you do feel that you have a bias of negativity, I think you want to do your best to see the positives. So for instance, if you feel that your millennial is always asking for lots of feedback and support, isn't that an opportunity to mold your employees, to shape them? If you give that support, there might be a positive result to it. But I think my biggest advice is to try your best to turn that around and see the advantages of the millennials in your family as opposed to some of those negatives. Next question, let's go to the millennial perspective. How do you handle not identifying with most millennials, even though I am one, says this listener, and getting lumped with the negative traits of millennials? I'm going to take this opportunity to pitch my TEDx talk. It's about time we stop shaming millennials, because I actually think it is awful that millennials have this obnoxious, annoying stigma. I think some of it is that there's so much more media attention on this generation because of social media that probably all the rest of us would have gotten criticized too if we had existed in the time of Twitter. But one of the things that you can do is to first really understand what that millennial image is. Entitlement comes to mind, wanting too much feedback, feeling like you need to make a difference every minute of every day, and simply saying to whoever you feel is criticizing you or has that perspective to say, hey, I know what the stereotypes are about millennials, but I'm a hard worker. I want to learn as much as I can. I think being a really, really good listener and showing your value by hard work and simply getting things done is the best way, I think, to overcome any stereotype. And know that it might take a while. People do sometimes come in with preconceived notions. It's not fair, but it's true. The best way, I think, to overcome that is to listen more than you talk and to simply deliver results. Tim Ferriss always says, be so good they can't ignore you. And I think that's really good advice for millennials and anyone. These are great questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted these questions. Let's take another boomer question. How do boomers contribute without being perceived as teaching and still asking, being open to younger solutions? I think questions are absolutely the most tremendous form of learning. My grandpa used to say, there's a reason that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them accordingly. Listen, listen, listen. I think any boomer who is worried about being perceived as teaching or dictating too much is a prime candidate for a reverse mentor. Go and ask the youngest person on your team, what do you think? What's your perspective on this? Asking questions is a great management tool, and showing that you truly listen to the answers, which doesn't mean you always do what the other person says, but you're willing to listen, I think overcomes any bias someone has that you're not willing to take other people seriously. Okay, next question. What is the #1 reason you see as to why companies have been slow to adapt to millennial work styles and preferences? And then why are we still shaming them or assuming they're wrong? I'm going to be honest, I think there's a lot of fear. I think a lot of people who have come through the workplace in a particular way, I think we're a little bit scared because we learned how to do things one way, and many people got really good at that. We got good at hierarchy. We got good at long meetings. We got good at command and control. And now suddenly a new generation has come in and said, yeah, we're going to do things differently. So I think that that can be very intimidating and very hard to deal with. So I'd really encourage everyone to have some empathy for how hard it is to change. I also think sometimes we're not as good at the new tools. If you have not been a transparent leader, it's very hard to completely change your style. So I think understanding that from a more millennial perspective is really important. The next thing I would do is to allow people to take their time to change and explain their perspective. So I think if someone, let's say you have a very command and control leader, you can always say, you know, I'd love to have a meeting where I can interview you and ask you some questions. Really approach it as a request as opposed to a demand, and that can be a valuable way to deal with someone who needs change. How I deal with it from a macro perspective is I show the numbers. And I don't say you need to change because it's better or because times are changing. I say you need to change because millennials are the largest generation of the workforce and they're your customers. And we're going to make more money if they are more successful. We're going to retain more employees and be more productive if we're successful. Sometimes the business argument for change is better than the argument that it's the right thing to do or that it's a nice thing to do. Okay, next question. Any best practices for how millennials can help shift culture in the workplace in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion? So these are such critically important topics. And here's where I think millennials can really lead this conversation, frankly, because a lot of millennials grew up with more comfort level with a lot of these conversations. They were taking place on social media, or they've simply been more in the zeitgeist and the news. So the first step I would say if you're in an organization is I'm a really big fan of employee resource groups, ERGs. And if you are an entrepreneur or outside of an organization, there are many professional associations and affinity groups as well, but there really is strength and power in numbers. So if you're part of a committee or an ERG or a professional association, you can invite people on your team to come to events, to listen to speakers. You can share your favorite books and podcasts and blog posts. You know, I think in some ways we're still in the education phase of diversity and inclusion, which feels ridiculous for how long a lot of us have been in the workplace. But if there's somebody who you think needs to change, inviting them to hear a speaker, inviting them to listen to a podcast or read a book that's been meaningful to you can be a very, very strong first step. And I know sometimes it can be hard to do that as an individual. So I think joining a group that is interested and involved in these topics is going to be a very important thing to do. I'm going to take one more question and we've received so many fantastic questions that I'm going to answer many, many more on Twitter and on my blog. But right now, I will take one additional question today. And this is a great question that we'll wrap up with about millennials as leaders. How can millennials overcome the fear that older generations might judge their management style more harshly simply because the millennial manager is younger than they are? So I mentioned that almost 40% of Americans are reporting to a boss who's younger than they are. So this is a very common issue today. I do think that millennials in some ways are going to lead differently, but I think millennials also face the same challenges as any leader, which is developing respect from the people that you lead, being a good manager of people, and developing a team atmosphere. So I know I've said this a few times during the Q&A, but listening is so incredibly important for any leader. One of the best ways to show older members of your team or any member of your team that you genuinely care about them, and I go back to that Google Project Oxygen study, to say, I really care about your opinion. I'd like to hear your perspective. How would you handle this issue? It doesn't mean that you can't follow your own strategy or make your own decisions. It means that you're willing to listen to other people's perspectives. And I think that's a human desire, particularly for those who've been in the workplace a long time. So share those perspectives and listen to the people on your team to talk about how they've done things, what their ideas are, and what their recommendations are for you. The second and final thing that I'll say is, as I mentioned, it doesn't mean you have to do what other people say. Own your leadership. Own your success and power. Whatever age or generation you are put in a leadership role for a reason. You don't have to apologize. You don't have to be intimidated. You don't have to let someone push you around because you're younger or just because you're new. Really own it. Feel powerful in your position. Doesn't mean being arrogant or entitled, but when you make a decision, you can declare it firmly. When you plan an event, you can do it with pride and let people know that you're comfortable in your position, and often a lot of respect goes with it. So that combination of listening and confidence, I think, is unbeatable for millennial leaders and leaders of all generations. So we've come to the end of our time. Thank you for joining the Managing the Mix webinar. I'm so grateful for your participation and your interest. As I mentioned, we'll be continuing the conversation on Twitter and on my blog. You can find me at Lindsey Pollak. You can feel free to send me an email with any feedback or comments or additional questions, and I will be blogging about this topic as I always do. A reminder that this webinar has been recorded. You'll be receiving an email with it tomorrow that you are welcome to share with a colleague or anyone who might be interested, and you'll also receive a brief survey about your participation. Thank you again, and goodbye.